Benjamin Harper was the kind of man who valued his independence above all else. His property, nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest, was his sanctuary. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement, a symbol of self-reliance, and a boundary between him and the world he preferred to keep at arm's length. The fence that surrounded his property reflected that same principle. Crafted by his own hands over months of labor, it was a tall, intricately designed barrier made of dark wood and reinforced steel. Every plank, every bolt, every detail spoke to Benjamin's meticulous nature and his determination to protect what was his. The fence wasn't merely functional, it was an extension of him, representing his ideals and the effort he had poured into maintaining his own space. The surrounding neighborhood, however, didn't share his appreciation for individuality. Many of the other homes in the area adhered to a uniform-style beige walls, cookie-cutter lawns, and fences that were bland and uninspired. It wasn't long after Benjamin moved in that the local neighborhood association began sending polite but firm letters suggesting he adjust his fence to better suit the aesthetic of the community. Benjamin ignored them at first, assuming they were empty posturing from people with too much time on their hands. But as the months wore on, the letters became more frequent and their tone less friendly. Words like compliance and violations began appearing, and it was clear that whoever was behind these notices wouldn't let the matter rest. Still, Benjamin was unbothered. He had the paperwork to prove his fence met all local codes, and he wasn't about to let anyone dictate how he managed his property. His confidence in his own autonomy was unshakable until the night it all began to unravel. It was a quiet evening, the kind that Benjamin cherished. The forest surrounding his property was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves as nocturnal animals stirred. He sat on his porch with a cup of strong coffee, enjoying the solitude. The fence, illuminated faintly by the porch light, stood as a reassuring silhouette against the darkness beyond. At some point, Benjamin noticed a faint sound, a dull thud, followed by a splintering crack. He frowned and set his mug down, listening intently. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakably the noise of wood breaking. Alarmed, Benjamin grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the source. As he approached the edge of his property, his beam of light revealed the unmistakable sight of destruction. A section of his fence lay in ruins, the wooden panels shattered and the steel supports bent at unnatural angles. The ground was littered with debris, and muddy tire tracks cut through the grass like scars. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a deliberate act of aggression. A mix of anger and disbelief surged through him as he surveyed the damage. His fence, the one he had poured so much time and effort into, had been torn down without warning or reason. Among the debris, he noticed something that caught his eye, a small, laminated sign half buried in the dirt. Pulling it free, he read the message printed in bold, impersonal letters, non-compliant structure. Removed per directive, there was no signature, no contact information, just a cold declaration of authority. Benjamin's jaw tightened as he crushed the sign in his fist. This wasn't just about aesthetics or community rules, this was a direct violation of his property and his rights. Whoever had done this hadn't even bothered to inform him beforehand, let alone seek his consent. It felt like a personal attack, an attempt to undermine everything he had built for himself. The following morning he made his way to the local association's office, determined to confront whoever was responsible. The receptionist, a young woman with a polished smile that didn't reach her eyes, listened to his complaint with feigned sympathy before directing him to someone higher up. After waiting for what felt like an eternity in a sterile, overly air-conditioned room, Benjamin was finally ushered into a small office. The man who greeted him introduced himself as the association's compliance officer. He was neatly dressed, with an air of self-importance that grated on Benjamin instantly. The conversation was brief and infuriating. The compliance officer claimed the fence had been in violation of community guidelines and that the association had acted within its rights to remove it. When Benjamin demanded to see the specific guidelines he had supposedly violated, the officer produced a binder filled with pages of dense, legalistic language. Benjamin scanned through it, but nothing he read seemed to justify the destruction of his property. "I have permits for that fence," Benjamin said, his voice measured but firm. It's within code. You had no right to tear it down. The officer shrugged, his expression one of polite indifference. The association's guidelines supersede individual preferences. You'll need to submit a request if you want to rebuild, and it will have to meet our standards. Benjamin left the office seething. It wasn't just the act of tearing down his fence that infuriated him, it was the smug arrogance of the people behind it, their assumption that they could trample over his rights without consequence. As he drove back to his property, his mind raced with thoughts of how to respond. One thing was certain: he wasn't going to roll over and let them dictate how he lived on his own land. That evening, as he walked the perimeter of his property, examining the damage, Benjamin noticed something peculiar. Beneath the wreckage of the fence, partially concealed by dirt and debris, was a photograph. It was old and weathered, the edges curled with age. He picked it up and studied it under the fading light. The image showed a house that looked eerily similar to his, though it was surrounded by a different type of fence, one that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding forest. In the foreground stood a group of people, their faces obscured by shadows. On the back of the photograph, in faint, almost illegible handwriting, was a single sentence: "They won't stop until it's gone." Benjamin felt a chill creep up his spine as he pocketed the photograph. This was no ordinary neighborhood dispute. Something larger, more insidious, was at play, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The destruction of Benjamin's fence wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a declaration of war, and he knew it. The following morning, he woke up with a sharp resolve to address the situation head-on. After the infuriating conversation with the compliance officer the day before, Benjamin realized that this wasn't about rules or guidelines, it was about control. Yet something about the cryptic photograph he'd found the night before haunted him. It didn't feel random. It felt personal, as though someone had left it there deliberately. His first instinct was to document everything. Pulling out his camera, he spent the early hours of the day photographing the damaged fence, the muddy tire tracks, and the surrounding area. He wanted proof not just of the damage but of the aggressive tactics being used against him. As he examined the tire tracks more closely, he noticed something odd. They weren't made by a regular truck or utility vehicle, they were too narrow, almost as if the tires belonged to an industrial cart or specialized machinery. It didn't make sense, but Benjamin filed the observation away in the back of his mind, knowing it might be useful later. He returned to his porch, reviewing the photographs on his camera's screen, when the sound of an approaching car broke the quiet. Benjamin turned to see a sleek black SUV pulling up in front of his property. The vehicle was polished to a mirror-like shine, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see who was inside. The driver's door opened, and a man in a gray suit stepped out. He was tall, with sharp features, and an air of authority that immediately put Benjamin on edge. "Mr. Harper," the man said as he approached, his tone polite but formal. "I'm David Grant, a representative from the community board. I understand you've had some concerns about recent actions taken on your property." Benjamin crossed his arms, his expression hard. "Concerns? Is that what you call tearing down my fence without so much as a warning?" David smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant to disarm, but that only served to irritate Benjamin further. "I assure you, Mr. Harper, everything was done in accordance with the guidelines set forth by the community. I came by personally to address any misunderstandings and to offer assistance in resolving the matter." Benjamin didn't buy the man's smooth demeanor for a second. "Assistance? You mean more rules and hoops to jump through?" He stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. "I've already been told my fence was non-compliant, but no one's been able to tell me exactly why. Now you're here, acting like you're doing me a favor. What's really going on?" David's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes: annoyance, maybe even anger. "Mr. Harper," he said evenly, "we understand that change can be frustrating, especially for those who value their privacy. But the board's decisions are made with the best interests of the entire community in mind. If you'd like to rebuild your fence, we can provide you with the necessary specifications." Benjamin shook his head, his patience wearing thin. "I have permits. My fence was within code. You had no right to touch it." David's polite facade began to crack. With all due respect, Mr. Harper, community standards evolve. It's not just about permits, it's about creating harmony among neighbors. Your fence was, let's say, an outlier. We're simply ensuring consistency. Before Benjamin could respond, David held up a hand as if to cut him off. "I'll leave you with this," he said, pulling a sleek folder from his briefcase. "Inside, you'll find the updated guidelines, as well as an application form for rebuilding. I suggest you review them carefully." Without waiting for a reply, David turned and walked back to his SUV. The tires crunched against the gravel as the vehicle pulled away, leaving Benjamin standing in the driveway with the folder in his hands. He didn't open it. Instead, he threw it onto the porch table with a snarl of frustration. This wasn't about harmony or guidelines, it was about control, plain and simple. Determined not to let the matter rest, Benjamin decided to pay a visit to a few neighbors. If the community board was this aggressive with him, there was a good chance others had been targeted as well. He started with an older couple who lived a few houses down. They'd always been friendly in passing, though not overly chatty. When Benjamin explained what had happened, the husband, Tom, shook his head grimly. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last," Tom said, his voice low. "They came after us about our shed last year, said it was too close to the property line, even though it's been there for over a decade. We fought it for months, but eventually we gave up. It wasn't worth the stress." His wife chimed in, her tone tinged with bitterness. "They'll wear you down, Benjamin. They always do. It's easier to just go along with whatever they want." But Benjamin wasn't the type to back down, and their defeatist attitude only strengthened his resolve. Over the next few days, he continued to gather information, speaking to other neighbors and documenting their stories. Patterns began to emerge. It seemed the community board had a habit of targeting properties they deemed unsuitable for reasons that were often vague or arbitrary. One night, while reviewing his notes, Benjamin's phone buzzed with a notification from his security system. It was an alert from one of the motion-activated cameras he'd installed along the perimeter of his property. Opening the app, he saw grainy footage of two figures near the remains of his fence. They were moving quickly, their faces obscured by hoods. One of them appeared to be holding a crowbar. Benjamin grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat before heading outside. By the time he reached the area, the intruders were gone, but they'd left behind more damage. Sections of the remaining fence had been ripped out, and one of the steel supports was bent, as though it had been struck with significant force. On the ground, he found another laminated sign, similar to the first one, but this time the message was different. "This is your final warning. Comply or face the consequences." Benjamin's hands clenched into fists as he read the words. Whoever was behind this wasn't just enforcing rules, they were escalating the situation into something far more personal. The next morning, he called the local police again, demanding that they send someone to investigate. An officer finally arrived later that afternoon, but their response was underwhelming. "It's probably just kids messing around," the officer said with a shrug. "We'll file a report, but there's not much we can do without solid evidence." Benjamin felt like he was hitting a brick wall at every turn. The community board was stonewalling him, the police were dismissive, and his property was under constant attack. Yet despite the mounting frustration, he refused to give in. If they thought they could bully him into compliance, they were sorely mistaken. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Benjamin stood in the ruins of his fence and made a decision. If they wanted a fight, he would give them one. But he wouldn't play by their rules. He would rebuild his fence stronger, tougher, and more impenetrable than before. And this time, he wouldn't just be protecting his property, he'd be sending a message. Benjamin Harper was not a man who believed in losing battles. If the community board thought they could intimidate him into submission, they clearly didn't know the kind of person they were dealing with. The morning after the latest vandalism, Benjamin's resolve hardened. He wasn't just going to rebuild his fence, he was going to fortify it to such an extent that no one would dare touch it again. But this time, he wasn't going to simply patch up the damage and wait for another attack. He knew he needed to think several steps ahead, like a chess player anticipating the next move. The first step was assessing the full extent of the destruction. He spent hours walking the perimeter of his property, cataloging every broken plank, every bent steel support, and every sign of tampering. What he found only fueled his anger. The damage wasn't random, it was calculated. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to strike to weaken the structure, as though they'd studied the fence beforehand. The bent steel posts were the most telling. They hadn't been damaged by simple tools or brute force. The marks on them suggested the use of heavy-duty equipment. Benjamin ran his hand along one of the posts, feeling the rough grooves left by what must have been industrial machinery. This wasn't the work of bored teenagers or neighborhood troublemakers. It was deliberate, professional, and methodical. Once he finished his assessment, he called a contractor he trusted and laid out his plans. The new fence would be more than just a barrier, it would be a fortress. Reinforced concrete would form the foundation, with steel beams driven deep into the ground for added stability. The wooden panels would be replaced with a composite material resistant to weather, rot, and impact. Benjamin was clear about his intentions. This fence would be unbreakable. As the contractor and his crew began their work, Benjamin stayed close, watching every step of the process. He wasn't going to leave anything to chance. While the workers labored, Benjamin used the opportunity to install additional security measures. He placed hidden cameras in strategic locations around the perimeter and upgraded his motion detectors to cover more ground. If someone tried to mess with his property again, he would know about it immediately. It didn't take long for word of Benjamin's project to spread through the neighborhood. Some of the neighbors came by out of curiosity, watching the construction with a mix of fascination and unease. A few of them tried to strike up conversations, asking why he was going to such lengths for a fence. Benjamin kept his responses curt, unwilling to share too much. He didn't trust anyone at this point, not after what had happened. One afternoon, as the crew poured the concrete foundation, Benjamin noticed a car parked at the edge of the street. It wasn't one he recognized. The windows were tinted, and the driver didn't get out. The car stayed there for over an hour, its engine idling quietly. Benjamin felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed strange vehicles lingering near his property since the incidents began. Deciding he'd had enough, Benjamin walked purposefully toward the car. As soon as he reached the curb, the driver sped off, the tires kicking up gravel as the car disappeared down the street. Benjamin stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle, his fists clenched. Whoever was behind this wasn't even trying to hide their presence anymore. They wanted him to know he was being watched. The next day, the contractor's crew finished the initial phase of the fence. The reinforced concrete had set, and the steel beams were in place. Benjamin stood at the edge of his property, running his hand over the cool, solid surface of the new structure. It wasn't just a fence, it was a statement. But his sense of accomplishment was short-lived. That evening, just as the sun was setting, Benjamin received an unexpected visitor. David Grant, the smooth-talking representative from the community board, pulled up in his black SUV and stepped out with his usual air of confidence. He was holding a clipboard and a manila folder, the same polished smile plastered across his face. "Mr. Harper," David said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "I see you've been busy. Quite an impressive structure you've got there." Benjamin crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, Grant?" David chuckled softly, as though they were old friends sharing a joke. "I'm here on behalf of the board to discuss a few concerns. It seems your new fence may not comply with certain regulations." Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "Regulations? You mean the ones you keep changing whenever it suits you?" David's smile didn't falter, but there was an edge to his voice as he replied. "The board has a responsibility to ensure that all properties adhere to the community's standards. Your new fence, while certainly robust, raises some issues regarding its height and material composition." Benjamin took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "This fence is on my property. It's within the legal limits, and I have the permits to prove it. You and your board don't get a say in what I build here." David held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "I'm just here to pass along the board's concerns. We wouldn't want this to escalate unnecessarily." Benjamin stared him down, unflinching. "It already has. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them almost palpable. Then, without another word, David handed Benjamin the manila folder and walked back to his UV. The car disappeared down the street, leaving Benjamin alone with the folder in his hands. He opened it as he walked back to the house, his frustration mounting with each page he flipped through. The folder was filled with documents outlining supposed violations related to his new fence, along with thinly veiled threats of fines and legal action if he didn't bring it into compliance. It was clear that the board wasn't going to back down, no matter how justified Benjamin's actions were. That night, as he sat on his porch, Benjamin's thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of an engine. He looked up to see another car, this one unmarked, slowly driving past his property. Its headlights flickered briefly before the car disappeared around the bend. Benjamin's jaw tightened. He had the distinct feeling he was being tested, pushed to see how far he would go. He wasn't going to wait for them to make the next move. If they wanted a fight, he was ready to give them one, but this time he would do it on his terms. As the moonlight glinted off the steel beams of his newly fortified fence, Benjamin made a silent vow no matter what they tried, he would protect what was his. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about standing his ground against those who thought they could take it from him. Benjamin Harper's newly reinforced fence stood as a monument to his defiance, but it also felt like an unspoken challenge to whoever was behind the escalating attacks on his property. Over the next few days, the tension surrounding his home only grew. He knew he was being watched, the strange cars parked down the road, the sound of footsteps in the woods at night, and the occasional unfamiliar drone buzzing overhead made it impossible to ignore. Yet the silence from the community board only made him more uneasy. They hadn't responded to his rejection of their compliance notice, and Benjamin knew that the next move wouldn't be a polite knock on the door, it would be something more calculated. Determined not to sit idly by, Benjamin spent his days further preparing his property. He upgraded his security system to include floodlights triggered by motion sensors and installed a concealed series of cameras to cover blind spots the intruders might exploit. He also began reinforcing his driveway gates with steel plating. If they wanted a fight, they'd have to work harder than smashing a few wooden panels. But preparation wasn't enough. Benjamin wanted answers. He decided to pay another visit to his neighbor Tom, the older man who had hinted at trouble during their last conversation. When Benjamin arrived, Tom was sitting on his porch with a beer in hand, staring out at his yard as though lost in thought. "I was hoping you could tell me more about what's really going on around here," Benjamin said, getting straight to the point. Tom hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if to check if anyone was listening. "You're pushing back harder than most," he finally said. "That's good in theory, but these people don't play fair. They don't just want your compliance, they want your land." Benjamin frowned. "Why my land? There's nothing special about it." Tom let out a bitter laugh. "It's not about what you see. It's about what's underneath. A few years back, someone came around talking about a development deal. New infrastructure, luxury homes, the whole pitch. They needed to buy up several properties to make it happen. Most folks sold willingly, they offered good money, too. But the ones who didn't, he trailed off, his face darkening. Let's just say they weren't left with much of a choice." The words hit Benjamin like a punch to the gut. His suspicions about the community board being part of a larger scheme now felt more like a certainty, and no one fought back. "Not for long," Tom admitted. "The ones who tried. Things didn't go well for them. Legal trouble, accidents, fires. After a while, people just gave in. Cheaper that way." Benjamin left Tom's house with a mix of anger and determination boiling inside him. If this was some kind of coordinated effort to force him out, then he needed to find proof, something concrete he could use to expose what was happening. That night, as he reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras, he noticed something strange. Around 2 a.m., a figure appeared near the edge of his property. Unlike the previous intruders, this person didn't carry tools or attempt to vandalize anything. Instead, they crouched down near the base of the fence, appearing to examine it closely. After a few minutes, the figure placed something on the ground, a small device with blinking lights, and walked away into the woods. Benjamin's heart raced as he rewound the footage and watched it again. The device looked like some kind of tracker or sensor, though he couldn't be sure without getting a closer look. The idea that someone was actively monitoring his property in real time made his skin crawl. Grabbing a flashlight and a crowbar, he headed outside, determined to retrieve whatever had been left behind. The woods were eerily quiet as Benjamin approached the spot where the figure had been. The blinking lights of the device stood out against the dark earth, and he knelt down to inspect it. It was small, no larger than a deck of cards, and made of matte black plastic. There were no visible markings or logos, just a single red light blinking steadily. Carefully, he pried it from the ground and carried it back to the house. Once inside, he examined it more closely, but the device gave away nothing. It was sealed tight, with no screws or openings he could find. Frustrated, Benjamin decided to reach out to someone who might know more. He called an old friend, Marcus, who worked in tech security and owed him a favor from years back. When Marcus arrived the next morning, he immediately set to work examining the device. "This isn't something you buy off the shelf," Marcus said, his tone serious. "It's custom-made. High-end stuff, too probably military grade or close to it. Whoever left this here is playing a very different game." Benjamin's jaw tightened. "Can you figure out what it does?" "Give me some time," Marcus replied. "But if I had to guess, it's probably a tracker. Something that sends data to whoever's on the other end. Could be monitoring movement, maybe even mapping the area." While Marcus worked, Benjamin's phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was from his lawyer, who had been helping him file complaints and document the attacks. The news wasn't good. "The board's filed a legal injunction against your fence," the lawyer said. "They're claiming it poses a safety hazard and violates zoning laws. If they win, they'll have the right to tear it down completely." Benjamin gritted his teeth. "And how likely are they to win?" "With the right judge?" "Very likely," the lawyer admitted. "These cases are hard to fight, especially when the other side has connections. But we'll do everything we can." Hanging up the phone, Benjamin felt a sense of grim determination. They weren't just trying to intimidate him, they were attempting to crush him through every possible channel. But he wasn't going to let them win. Later that evening, Marcus called him into the workshop. "I've got good news and bad news," he said, holding up the now open device. "The good news is I cracked it. It's definitely a tracker, and it's been sending data to a specific IP address. I traced it to a company called Trinity Development. They're big in real estate and construction." Benjamin's stomach sank. "And the bad news?" "The bad news is they probably already know you found it," Marcus said, gesturing to the now disabled device. "As soon as I opened it, the signal stopped. If they're paying attention, they'll know their tracker is compromised." Benjamin's mind raced as he processed the information. Trinity Development was a name he'd heard before Tom had mentioned it when talking about the development deals. If they were behind this, then the community board was likely just a front for their operations. "Do you think they'll come after me directly?" Benjamin asked. Marcus hesitated. "If they're bold enough to use equipment like this, then yeah, I think they will. You've made yourself a problem, and they don't seem like the type to let problems slide." That night, Benjamin barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made him jump. He knew the stakes were higher now, and the next move would come sooner rather than later. Sure enough, just before dawn, the floodlights outside his house blazed to life. Benjamin rushed to the window to see two black CVs parked just beyond his gates. A group of men in dark clothing stood near the vehicles, discussing something in low voices. One of them pointed toward the fence. Benjamin grabbed his shotgun and stepped out onto the porch, making sure they could see him. He didn't say a word he didn't need to. The sight of him standing there, armed and unflinching, was enough to make the men hesitate. After a tense moment, they got back into their vehicles and drove off. As the sun rose, Benjamin stood by the fence, his grip on the shotgun tight. The message was clear: they weren't backing down, but neither was he. This wasn't just a fight for his property anymore. It was a fight for his right to stand his ground against forces that thought they could take whatever they wanted. And Benjamin Harper was ready to make them regret underestimating him. The confrontation at dawn left Benjamin Harper more determined than ever to hold his ground. The sight of those black SUVs and the men scoping out his property had shaken him, but not in the way they intended. He wasn't intimidated, he was furious. If these people thought they could bully him into giving up, they were about to learn how wrong they were. As he stood by his newly fortified fence, staring at the empty road where the SUVs had been, Benjamin felt a surge of defiance. He wasn't just going to defend his home, he was going to make sure they regretted ever targeting him. By mid-morning he was back on the phone with Marcus, relaying the events of the previous night. Marcus wasn't surprised. "They're escalating," Marcus said flatly. "You exposed their tracker, so now they're moving into the intimidation phase. They want you rattled." "Well, they've failed," Benjamin replied. "But I need to hit back. I need more than just defense, I need leverage." Marcus paused, then said, "If Trinity Development is as big as I think, they've got skeletons in their closet. Every company like that does. I can start digging, see if I can find anything that connects them to dirty tactics or shady deals. But you need to be ready. If you push them, they're going to push back harder." Benjamin thanked him and hung up. He didn't have time to wait for Marcus's investigation to bear fruit. The SUVs had been a clear warning that things were about to escalate further, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. He spent the rest of the day reinforcing his perimeter. He replaced the locks on his gates with tamper-proof models, laid gravel along the driveway to make it impossible for anyone to approach silently, and installed additional floodlights. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, Benjamin sat on his porch, shotgun resting against the railing. The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. He was on edge, his senses heightened, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. It wasn't long before the silence was broken. A low, rumbling sound reached his ears, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. He stood and grabbed the shotgun, his eyes fixed on the road. Moments later, a convoy of vehicles appeared, 3 black trucks with high beams cutting through the darkness. They rolled to a stop just outside his gate, engines idling ominously. Benjamin didn't wait for them to make the first move. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the gate, the shotgun held casually but visibly in his hands. As he approached, the driver's door of the lead truck opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark tactical gear. His presence radiated authority, but his face was devoid of expression. "Mr. Harper," the man said, his voice calm but cold, "we're here to inspect your property. Open the gate." Benjamin's grip on the shotgun tightened. "You're not setting foot on my property," he said firmly. "Turn around and leave." The man's lips curled into a faint smirk. "You don't have a choice. This is a legal matter. The community board has authorized us to conduct this inspection." Benjamin shook his head. "I don't care what they've authorized. You're trespassing. And if you don't leave now, things are going to get ugly." The man took a step closer, his smirk fading. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Harper. You're outnumbered, and this doesn't have to end badly." Benjamin didn't flinch. "I don't care how many of you there are. You're not coming in." For a moment, it seemed like the man might back down, but then he raised a hand, signaling to the other trucks. Doors opened, and more men in tactical gear stepped out, their movements precise and coordinated. Benjamin counted at least 8 of them, all armed with what looked like crowbars and other tools meant for breaking and entering. His heart pounded, but he didn't show it. He chambered around in the shotgun, the sound echoing through the still night. "The next step you take will be your last," he said, his voice steady. The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. He knew they could overpower Benjamin if it came to it, but the risk wasn't worth it. After a tense moment, he raised his hand again, signaling the others to stand down. "This isn't over," the man said, his tone laced with warning. "You can't fight us forever." Benjamin didn't reply. He simply watched as the men climbed back into their trucks and drove off into the night. But as the sound of their engines faded, he knew this was far from a victory. They would be back, and next time they wouldn't stop at intimidation. The following day, Benjamin woke to find another surprise waiting for him. A fresh set of documents had been taped to his gate, this time stamped with an official-looking seal. The notice accused him of multiple violations, including obstruction of community efforts and unauthorized construction, and demanded immediate compliance. The fines listed were astronomical, far beyond anything a normal homeowner could reasonably afford. Benjamin read the notice carefully, his anger growing with each line. It was a blatant attempt to bleed him dry financially, to force him to give up through sheer economic pressure. But he wasn't going to let them win. He immediately called his lawyer, who confirmed his suspicions. "This is a classic strong-arm tactic," the lawyer said. "They're trying to bury you in legal fees and fines so you'll sell. It's not legal, but proving that will take time." Time was something Benjamin didn't have. That afternoon he met with Marcus, who had finally uncovered some dirt on Trinity Development. "You were right," Marcus said, sliding a folder across the table. "They've done this before. Same pattern: target properties, apply pressure through local boards, and force people to sell. They've been tied to at least 3 other cases in this state, but no one's ever managed to stop them." The folder contained copies of court documents, complaints filed by other homeowners, and internal emails that hinted at collusion between Trinity and local officials. It was damning evidence, but it wasn't enough. "We need something bigger," Marcus said, "something that ties them directly to what's happening here." That night, Benjamin prepared for the next attack. He reinforced his gates with additional steel and set up motion-triggered alarms around the perimeter. He wasn't just defending his property anymore, he was preparing for war. And war came sooner than he expected. At around 3 a.m., the alarms blared, jolting Benjamin awake. He grabbed his shotgun and rushed outside to find 2 trucks ramming the reinforced gate. Sparks flew as the metal held firm, but the impact was enough to bend the frame. The men in the trucks didn't stop. They rammed again and again, determined to break through. Benjamin didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound cutting through the chaos like a thunderclap. The trucks stopped, and the men inside hesitated. But instead of retreating, one of them stepped out, holding a canister of what looked like gasoline. Benjamin aimed the shotgun directly at him. "Don't even think about it," he growled. The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. After a moment, he climbed back into the truck, and the vehicles retreated into the night. As Benjamin stood there, breathing heavily, he realized this was only the beginning. They weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But neither was he. If they thought they could break him, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The following morning, Benjamin Harper was done waiting. After the night's brazen attack on his property, he knew that defending his land was no longer enough. These people, whoever they were, had no intention of playing fair, and their desperation was growing. It was time to flip the script. Sitting in his workshop with the shotgun still leaning against the wall from the night before, Benjamin reviewed the documents Marcus had given him. Trinity Development had left a trail, albeit a thin one, and it was enough to start piecing together their methods. The most damning piece of evidence was a series of emails between a Trinity Development project manager and a local zoning official. Though vague in wording, the emails clearly implied that pressure had been applied to certain property owners to resolve delays in acquisition. One line stood out in particular: ensure that the board follows through on enforcement. The fence is the key to forcing a sale. Benjamin knew this was his opening. The community board wasn't acting independently, they were pawns in a larger scheme orchestrated by Trinity. But simply knowing this wasn't enough. He needed evidence strong enough to expose them publicly, something that would put them on the defensive and force them to back off. He decided to take a calculated risk. Later that afternoon, Benjamin called his lawyer and Marcus to coordinate a plan. While the lawyer began drafting a formal complaint to stall the board's latest fines and injunctions, Marcus suggested a more direct approach. Trinity operates out of a regional office about 2 hours from here, Marcus said. If they're orchestrating this, they'll have records, contracts, emails, maybe even financial transactions. If we can get inside, we might find what we need. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. Get inside? You mean break in? Marcus smirked. Not quite. Trinity's security isn't as tight as they'd like people to think. They use a third-party data center for their digital records. I've got a guy who can access it remotely. But we'll need to know what we're looking for. That means getting physical copies or document references from their office. It was risky, but Benjamin was out of options. That evening, he and Marcus drove to the Trinity Development office under the cover of darkness. The building was a modern, glass-fronted structure in the middle of a quiet industrial park. Marcus stayed in the car, monitoring nearby activity, while Benjamin approached the building. He wasn't planning to break any laws, but he wasn't above bending a few. He reached the employee entrance, where a security guard was stationed in a small booth. Benjamin had prepared for this. Dressed in work boots and a high-visibility vest, he approached the guard with a clipboard in hand. "Delivery for maintenance," he said gruffly, not giving the guard a chance to ask questions. The guard barely looked up, waving him through with a distracted nod. Once inside, Benjamin moved quickly. He didn't have much time before someone started asking questions. Using the directory posted near the elevator, he found his way to the third-floor office labeled Regional Projects. The room was dark and empty, but a desk near the back was cluttered with folders and papers. Benjamin began rifling through them, searching for anything that tied Trinity to the attacks on his property. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. A manila folder labeled Acquisition Priority Harper lay buried beneath a stack of blueprints. Inside, Benjamin found detailed notes on his property, including aerial photographs, financial projections, and a timeline of actions taken by the community board. One section listed escalation strategies, including the destruction of his fence and the imposition of fines. But what caught Benjamin's attention most was a handwritten memo attached to the folder. It read, "Proceed with maximum pressure. Acquisition must be completed before Q4. If resistance continues, consider legal action or alternative measures." The signature at the bottom was illegible, but it was enough to confirm that Trinity was directly orchestrating everything. As Benjamin stuffed the documents into his bag, he heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. Someone was coming. He slipped out of the office and made his way back to the entrance, moving as quietly as possible. The security guard barely glanced at him as he exited the building. Back in the car, Marcus scanned through the documents with a low whistle. "This is it," he said. "This is the proof we need. Trinity's running the show, and the board is just their puppet." Benjamin didn't respond. His mind was racing with the implications of what they'd found. This wasn't just about his property anymore, it was about exposing the corruption that had been driving people out of their homes for years. The next day, armed with the evidence, Benjamin's lawyer filed a formal lawsuit against Trinity Development and the community board, accusing them of collusion, harassment, and unlawful property interference. Copies of the documents were sent to local news outlets, and within hours, the story began gaining traction. Reporters started calling Benjamin, asking for interviews, but he kept his focus on the fight ahead. Trinity didn't take the attack lying down. That evening, as Benjamin sat on his porch, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Harper," a cold, familiar voice said. It was David Grant, the community board representative. "You've made a grave mistake. Do you really think a few documents will change anything?" Benjamin's grip on the phone tightened. "I think they'll be enough to make people like you nervous. And if you come near my property again, it won't just be lawyers you'll have to deal with." David chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "This isn't over," he said before the line went dead. That night, Benjamin didn't sleep. He knew Trinity would retaliate, but he also knew they were on the defensive now. For the first time, they weren't dictating the terms of the fight. He sat by the window, shotgun within reach, staring out at the newly reinforced fence that had sparked the entire battle. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Benjamin felt a strange sense of calm. The fight was far from over, but for the first time he felt like he was the one in control. Trinity Development had underestimated him, and now they were about to learn what happens when you push a man too far. The fallout from Benjamin Harper's actions came swiftly. The lawsuit, backed by the damning evidence Marcus had uncovered, sent shockwaves through the community. News outlets picked up the story, and within days, headlines about Trinity Development's corrupt practices and their collusion with the community board were plastered across local papers and social media. Neighbors who had once avoided Benjamin out of fear began rallying behind him, sharing their own stories of harassment and coercion. For the first time, the board and Trinity found themselves on the defensive, their carefully constructed facade of authority crumbling under public scrutiny. But the victory didn't come without consequences. Late one night, just days after the lawsuit was filed, Benjamin was jolted awake by the blaring of his alarms. He rushed outside, shotgun in hand, to find his reinforced gate engulfed in flames. The fire licked at the steel supports, casting an eerie orange glow across the driveway. Benjamin acted quickly, grabbing a fire extinguisher and dousing the flames before they could spread further. When the fire was out, he inspected the damage and found something chilling: a spray-painted message scrawled across the charred remnants of the gate. It read, "This is your last warning. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to scare him, they were escalating their threats." Despite the intimidation, Benjamin refused to back down. He called the police, who reluctantly opened an investigation, though it was clear they weren't eager to get involved in a fight with such powerful players. His lawyer, however, saw the attack as an opportunity. "This only strengthens our case," she told him. "It shows a pattern of harassment and intimidation." The days that followed were a blur of legal filings, media interviews, and tense nights spent on high alert. Trinity Development released a carefully worded statement denying any wrongdoing, claiming the lawsuit was an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the documents Benjamin had uncovered told a different story, and the pressure on the company continued to mount. Meanwhile, cracks began to appear within the community board itself. Several members resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons, while others publicly distanced themselves from David Grant, who had become the face of the board's aggressive tactics. Grant himself went silent, no longer showing up to meetings or responding to inquiries from reporters. The final blow came during a court hearing a month later. Trinity's lawyers, unable to refute the overwhelming evidence, agreed to a settlement. The company would pay substantial damages to Benjamin and several other affected homeowners, and the board was forced to nullify all fines and injunctions related to Benjamin's fence. More importantly, the settlement included a stipulation that Trinity abandon their development plans for the area entirely. As Benjamin left the courthouse that day, he felt an unfamiliar sense of relief. The fight had taken its toll financially, emotionally, and physically, but he had won. The community board was in shambles, Trinity had been exposed, and his property was finally safe. Back at home, Benjamin began the process of rebuilding not just his gate, but his sense of normalcy. The fence, once a symbol of defiance, now stood as a testament to his resilience. Neighbors who had once been indifferent or even hostile now stopped by to thank him for standing up to the forces that had bullied so many others into submission. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Benjamin sat on his porch with a cold beer in hand. The sounds of the forest surrounded him, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. The fight was over, and he had emerged stronger for it. But as he stared out at the reinforced fence, his mind lingered on the words spray-painted during the attack. "This is your last warning." Trinity Development had been forced to retreat, but Benjamin knew that companies like them rarely disappeared entirely. They rebranded, reorganized, and waited for the dust to settle before trying again. He took a long sip of his beer and leaned back in his chair, his shotgun resting within arm's reach. If they ever decided to come back, they'd find him ready just as they had before. For now, though, his land was his again, and that was all that mattered.